Okay, we'll now hear, this is all related and this is exciting. We're going to hear from Erik Danielson on tree height and age relationships in Northeastern Old Growth Forests. Erik has been focused on Northeastern Old Growth Forests through research and conservation work for the past decade. After a period of regional work with the Western New York Land Conservancy, he shifted into research at broader spatial scales in a position with the Tree Ring Lab at Harvard Forest. As the lab's projects wrap up in late 2025, he's excited to be shifting back into independent research and consulting with an emphasis on documentation, protection, and management of old growth ecology. Thanks so much for being with us, Erik, and take the podium.
All right. Thank you so much, Liz. All right, so I'm here today to present on tree height and age relationships in Northeastern Old Growth Forests. Obviously, height is one of the fundamental dimensions of what makes a tree, what makes a forest, as opposed to other vegetation types, other kinds of plants. And it's a subject I've been personally very interested in for quite a while. Got a lot in this talk, so I'm going to move kind of fast. A little bit of background. Measuring tree heights with the sign method, which is what Bob Leverett frequently talks about, has been a special interest and or compulsion, some might say, of mine for about the last 13 years. I find it to be a really fascinating experience, just spending time with a laser rangefinder in the forest. It's almost like you have a sixth sense that lets you physically feel the shape, the texture of the canopy above you, and how that interacts with the ground below. But as I learned to do that, my aims shifted from simply wondering, like, how tall is that tree, to where are the tallest trees? And initially, would go to the regional examples of old growth forests. That's kind of where you would imagine the oldest trees are. They must be the tallest trees, right? But as I spent more and more time covering the landscape, measuring trees in different places, that emphasis shifted largely to mature second growth forests, especially those that had not been disturbed in maybe a century and a half, where I found that even in the same productive landscapes as those regional old growth examples, it was often these younger stands where competition and composition seemed to push up canopies taller in their early maturity than they necessarily are in old growth in the long term. A few years ago, working with LIDAR really started to accelerate the pace of discoveries of new tall trees and tall forests, covering large areas of the Adirondacks and Allegheny State Park. And so these experiences really reshaped my own assumptions over time about tree height and its relationship with tree and forest age. But I also noticed that height was often being used as a proxy to a greater or lesser degree for forest age or biomass and remote sensing models at larger scales. So when I was given the opportunity to be a part of the Black Swan project at the Harvard Forest Tree Ring Lab, which Dave Orwig spoke about this morning, it struck me as a great opportunity to pair tree age and tree height information with greater precision than I could necessarily find in previous literature on northeastern forests. So the central questions I wanted to look at by doing that were, how do tree age and height relate to each other in old growth forests in the Northeast? How tall are typical old growth stands and trees in the Northeast? Is height a good predictor of tree or stand age in northeastern old growth? Does canopy height distinguish old growth forests from second growth forests? Do the results point at any areas of potential improvement for forest models based on remote sensing? And kind of the central hypothesis, based on all that experience measuring trees in different places, but without necessarily having the discrete age information to go with them, is that most trees in northeastern forests probably reach canopy height in less than 150 years from germination or understory release, and probably maintain a similar height over time after they establish a point in the canopy. So, what did we find? Oh, first, methods. So Dave spoke a little bit on the plot sampling structure of the Black Swan project earlier. So we measured heights with the sign method of all sampled trees in 16 old growth plots and 2 second growth plots in the Black Swan network using sign method with True Pulse 200X hypsometer. This measurement is more labor intensive than traditional clinometer, hypsometer measurements, but it avoids some common sources of geometric error for more consistent accuracy. These plots were part of the Black Swan project. We cored all trees over a 20-meter radius plot that were over 30 centimeters, and also added these smaller trees, 10 to 30 centimeters, within a 7-meter central nest. And the tree cores were mounted, cross-dated, and measured, which all took a lot of time and effort. The sample sites for which we had these sign height measurements were a subset of the Black Swan plots. You can see the green dots up there. That's the Adirondack region. Those are sites that are included in this height data. And then down in southwestern New York, northwest Pennsylvania, and northeastern Ohio, a region kind of generally influenced by Lake Erie on the Allegheny Plateau. I'm calling that EAP, Erie Allegheny Plateau. We had 5 sites there as well. So what did we find? Average canopy heights varied between the 2 regions, with few trees exceeding 30 meters, roughly 100 feet. You can see that line there in Adirondack sites, whereas Erie Allegheny Plateau sites were generally taller, with the major canopy species often 30 to 35 meters. Sites featuring fast-growing emergent tree species like white pine and tulip tree are those sites that you can see going quite a bit higher, up to about 45 meters. And we see that really reflected when we break it down by species as well. You can see that for some of these species, and I think there's a pointer here, and apologies that these are all species codes rather than full names. They wouldn't all fit down there. But for example, Tilia americana, American basswood here, we've only got 3 trees in the sample set. So we really want to, spend more time focused on these species, the major canopy species for which we have a lot of samples, a lot of replication. And again, it's just a couple species that get up to these higher, height levels of nearly 45 meters, the tulip tree and white pine, whereas our major canopy species, tend to go a little over 30 meters, but that differs significantly by region. Species that were shared between both regions, you can see that the Adirondack and Erie Allegheny Plateau sites, they differ in the average height. The Erie Allegheny Plateau sites, they tend to be significantly taller than they are in the Adirondacks. And that's not entirely unsurprising given the differences in climate, growing season, et cetera, between those 2 regions. So what happens when we plot tree heights against their ages as determined by tree ring analysis? There does appear to be a positive relationship early on, kind of flattening out to essentially no strong relationship, somewhere between 150 and 200 years. There are a lot of things going on here, though. Different species reach different maximum heights, and average heights differ between the regions, and all of those are thrown into this data together without any adjustment. So that could affect the shape of this distribution. So there's a couple different ways we can try to compensate for that. If we take the height of each tree as a percentage of the height of the tallest individual of its species in that region in our data, the results kind of reinforce the same pattern. They've kind of been equalized to, the tallest tree for its species and region is going to be riding on that 100 line. Still, this data does include species that are relatively short-lived like balsam fir, as well as very fast-growing species like tulip tree and white pine. So what happens if we limit things to just those species classically described as climax species in the Northeast, which are more or less shade-tolerant, long-lived, long-term canopy species? And again, the pattern we end up with is essentially the same. It's important to be clear that this graph does not show us the actual height growth history of any individual tree. We don't know if this hemlock over here took 450 years to get to that height, or if it reached that height around the same age as this hemlock and then stayed around the same height for the next few centuries. Demographics of the understory and canopy species within our plots also result in an uneven distribution of these species across life stages and canopy height. For example, there's a lot of American beech in the both lower age and lower height range down here. Nonetheless, the more data points are added, the more we might expect the resulting curve to represent an average trajectory of height growth for a given tree in the data set. Or at least that's the hope. Of course, when we're thinking about remote sensing and its relationship to the height and age of forests, what LiDAR sees is really just one moment in time and mainly just the trees that are present in the canopy. There doesn't appear to be a significant relationship between height and age in the canopy trees when taken alone across the aggregated data. And if you'll, I apologize for the ugly graph. If we want to exclude the effects of differences in site productivity, this is also true at the level of the individual plots. Sample sizes here become more limited, but it's apparent that there's no consistent relationship between height and age across the plots. Some appear positive, some appear negative. Most of them, the uncertainty in the trend line does not really provide us with any direction. The oldest trees at each plot usually aren't especially tall. There's a grand total of 2 of the 22 plots where the oldest tree is also the tallest, but the oldest trees are also usually not especially short either. So what are some possible explanations? There's a positive relationship between height and growth rate and a negative relationship between longevity and growth rate. One would expect the oldest trees for a given species and site to be relatively short. If height growth varies over time in response to competition, mature trees having reached a codominant to dominant canopy position may simply maintain or even lose height as growth is invested elsewhere, and time and weather take their toll. Both might be true, both might interact, a little hard to test, and I do think over time, comparison of growth histories in the tree rings themselves may offer insights. But these physical traits in the tree crowns that we see as typical and indicative of old growth status in the forest don't usually suggest to me that these trees have continually gained height over the course of their time in the canopy, whether hardwoods in the last slide or conifers as in this one. And some of the oldest trees we have in our data are included in this photograph, or set of photographs. So running a little low on time, but what about second growth forests? Many second growth forests in the Northeast have been recovering for more than 150 years. If many trees in old growth forests reach canopy heights in less than 150 years, do canopy height metrics distinguish old growth and second growth forests? In our data, not really. Pepperbox one, a little hard to pick out of this lineup. It's pretty much similar to all of the old growth mixed and deciduous plots in the Adirondacks. It is a site consisting of black cherry, red maple, yellow birch, all about 110 years old. Our second growth conifer plot that was logged between the 1850s and 1870s, Pollywog Pond 4 here, not dissimilar, but we have fewer points of comparison. But we basically have these 2 plots by accident because we were out to sample old growth forests, and we really need more second growth points of comparison to strengthen this analysis. That said, if old growth forests, could have done the colors a little different here. If it holds out that old growth forests aren't taller than mature second growth forests, but do have higher biomass, as we've seen in other studies, will height-based biomass models that use mature second growth forests as calibration points in most cases underestimate biomass in areas where old growth forests are present? This may have limited effect where old growth forests are very rare, but could have a larger effect in landscapes like the Adirondacks, where there is substantial old growth remaining. So data that models old growth probability across the landscape, as the Natural Heritage Program mentioned they're working on recently, could potentially be brought in to those biomass models along with calibration points in old growth forests to improve the biomass estimates across such landscapes, I would think. So some conclusions. Canopy heights in northeastern old growth forests vary by region and by species composition. Tree height appears to have little relationship to age beyond 150 years or so for major canopy species in northeastern forests in our data. Trajectories of height growth across lifespans in old growth forests need further study. The oldest trees in old growth forests are typically not especially tall, and canopy height metrics may not reliably distinguish old growth from recovering forests in the Northeast at this point in time, but can likely be used to exclude recently disturbed forests. So some next steps, as this analysis is still in very early stages. Sign heights will be measured for more of the plots in the network that we have core data from. More second growth plots, I would like to add, they would strengthen the comparison. And we'll examine the relationship between height, or between growth patterns in the actual tree rings and the height data that we have. I think that's going to be very interesting. And finally, we also have more conventionally gathered height data from the same plots. So we'll be comparing the results from sign and conventional height measurements across the plots. So just wanted to thank and acknowledge all of the many people who were members of our lab and supported the lab directly, as well as the many landowners and agencies who provided permits and permission to allow this project to happen. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Do we have time for some questions? Any questions? Is this working? Yes.
Although the data I realize is where you showed it, Eric, did you find or do you perceive any kind of differences when you did, various trips like to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in terms of how long those trees might continue to gain height? I'm thinking of some the pines and the tulip trees principally in those coal forests. I know that wasn't what you were there for, but I just wondered if you have any thoughts about that.
Sure. So we did do some additional work down in the Southern Appalachians for a separate project. That was also, investigating remote sensing-based models of where old-growth forests might be. Most of our direct sampling did not necessarily involve those forest types, but what did strike me was that there's very, very tall forest that's quite young, including those species. I did have a couple kind of bonus slides from that project in which these kind of side-on canopy profiles from aerial LiDAR sort of asked, can you pick out these second growth sites from these canopy profiles? And these two here are tall canopy forests that involve a tulip tree, and both of them are second growth. So they were, among the tallest plots. This is an old growth plot that also involves tulip tree. So I think it really is with these very fast-growing species that those differences are potentially quickest to disappear between old growth and regenerating forest. Not necessarily always, but it seems that the higher the productivity, perhaps the faster those differences disappear. Whereas in a landscape like northern Maine, these things might be a little easier to suss out over time.
One of your points of old forests don't seem to have the tallest trees. So I've looked at a lot of old growth forests and LiDAR and a lot of second growth, late successional, or maybe not fully second growth, they weren't cleared, but heavily managed at some point. And looking at the canopy profiles and looking at some of the statistics we calculated, the average heights in the old growth stands were lower than in the second growth stands, like due to the tree fall and the canopy turnover, which was just kind of interesting. Not only do they not have the tallest trees, they're also on average shorter, but they do have that canopy heterogeneity, which shows up in the LiDAR, which we're hoping to use to model that in the future. But I just thought that was cool.
Yeah. I mean, I really think the perfect recipe for very tall forests is where you have a regenerating forest that has a lot of these kind of light demanding species that tend to grow tall and fast, kind of dense, kind of when they're all still competing with each other vertically before they start having some of them age out, fall, die, that kind of thing. So very much speaks to what you're talking about.
So I was curious about if your conclusion to your studies is essentially saying height isn't everything?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I wrote a little note earlier during Linda's talk that, I felt like my conclusions kind of went along with a theme that ran through a number of talks that she had kind of just expressed, that, size in whatever dimension, height, tree size, whatever, is really less essential to what old growth kind of means when we're really getting into that than the complexity that develops over time.
And so with that, I was also kind of off of your point about rate of growth of tree species as reemergence or resilience in, regeneration of old growth systems. Looking at Nyssa sylvatica or Fagus grandiflora, in that they are a slower growing, denser wood in general. Does that then in turn, without any, hopefully, the insects coming on them, be a chance for longevity for them in the old growth?
Yeah, with Nyssa sylvatica, we definitely see that trade-off between longevity and growth rates, though on occasion you do also find Nyssa sylvatica that's growing very fast. It seems to be dependent on the site. Similarly with beech. In some places we've worked with beech that were very fast growing. And so probably between species, as you allude to, there's an effect, but also within a species. Trade-offs between growth rate and longevity.
One thing you might have to consider about the second growth stuff is that it's on generally better sites that were farmland or, easier to get to. And a lot of the old growth stuff is already in a compromised, steep, rocky site or whatever. So it's possible that if we had old growth still in these rich bottomland soils, they'd be far taller than a lot of the second growth, just because there's better spots.
Yeah, that site quality question is very important. I guess if I were to zoom back to that first slide, I would note that in terms of having measured a lot of very productive second growth in these same regions, as well as old growth in these same regions, some of these are on lower productivity sites, but a lot of them, for example, the Zoar Valley plots, Red House here, that's in Allegheny State Park, Mountain Pond, and some of the Mosier plots, some of the Allegheny League or Adirondack League plots, those are actually quite productive as far as they are in the same landscape with productive second growth in some cases, like Zoar Valley, and they're really quite comparable. So I think that due to the sampling design and particularly the regional components in the Adirondacks where we have large tracts of old growth forest, these actually are representative of productive forests rather than necessarily being scraps of old growth that were kind of hidden on unproductive and inaccessible portions of the landscape. All right.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. Let's join me in thanking Eric for a wonderful talk.